Hi, this is Darkin. I'm a freelance illustrator and concept artist, and today I'm going to take you through my process of painting a female hunter. I actually had the idea that I would focus mainly on painting the female form instead of the actual character design, so that's why I decided to put her in less clothing. I pretty much always start my paintings in black and white, so I just fill the entire canvas with a middle tone gray, and then usually I pick a darker color and start putting in some textures and some abstract shapes, just so that I have something to paint on top of. I'm using a texture brush that I think I got from someone else, but I can't even remember. I've been using it for so long. After I get some kind of texture down, I usually start painting the figure. I'm not really sure what I want the figure to look like yet, so I'm just starting off with the head. Usually I'll start off with line and value at the same time, just so that I can get a better feel of what it's actually going to look like. And I always paint in 300 dpi just in case I want to use the image for print. Typically the longest size of the canvas is between 4,000 and 5,000 pixels, but sometimes I'll push it higher than that if I know that the image is going to be printed very large, so sometimes I'll push it to maybe 10,000 pixels. I'm not quite sure, but I think I'm zoomed out to 12.5% right now. I usually try and make it so that I can see the entire canvas on the screen without having to scroll. That way I can get a better view of what the entire painting looks like. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with the figure, so I'm just trying to figure out what the pose should be. Just making sure there's lots of different angles in the body. I already had the idea that I wanted the female hunter to be pretty confident in herself and show that she has a lot of power. So having her chest thrust out gives her that sense of power. I'm not particularly worried with any of the details right now. I'm just trying to get the overall feel for the painting. I'm just trying to get the shapes in there. I decided the painting was going to be too big and it would probably take too long to paint the entire thing, so I just decided to change it and make some kind of a vignette painting and only paint half of the body. That way I can keep this tutorial in real time so I don't have to speed anything up. Technically, the first 12 minutes or so are 2 times speed just because for some reason I had forgotten to change the FPS from 4 to 12, so it looked a little choppy. So I had to speed it up, but the rest of the video is in real time. A lot of people ask me which brushes I use, and for the most part I just use the Photoshop round brush. And to edit the settings, you just go up here to the brush palette and you click on that. And I have shape dynamic selected, and I have the size jitters set to pressure with a little bit of a diameter. So if you move that up and down, you can see the size changes on the ends. And I also have other dynamics selected, and I have the opacity jitter set to pin pressure. That way I can get opacity changes just by how hard I'm pressing. And then airbrush and smoothing were default, so I just left those on there. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with her arm, so I'm just going to go ahead and start painting her skin. I usually start off with a higher key gray for the skin. During the early part of my painting, I usually tend to work in the middle keys instead of working really light or really dark. That way I can add my lights and darks at the end. So right now I'm just using the rectangular chalk tool, and you can go into the brush palette, and under brush tip shapes you can change the direction of the brush, so that way you can paint the planes going in different directions. I tend to use that brush a lot when I'm painting skin or faces. And I'm still thinking about the arm, so I'm not going to do it right now. You'll notice that I color pick a lot when I'm painting, And I just have that bound to one of my tablet keys, but you can also set it by pressing Alt on the keyboard. So right here I'm just checking the layers, and I'm going to merge a couple of the layers by hitting Command E or Control E for PCs. I tend to put things on several different layers now just so that I can see the different changes I make, or if I want to make a change but I'm not really sure if I want to keep it. That way I can go back to the original painting. And it's also good for concept work because art directors are going to ask for changes sometimes, and it's going to be a lot easier to change different pieces of armor or the pose if you have them on different layers. Since she's a female hunter, I had the idea that maybe she would wear a lot of leather with a few bits of metal. Maybe her pauldrons could be metal, but mainly she wears a lot of leather. I'm trying to get a good balance of armor and skin, but at the same time I'm trying to keep her looking light and agile. Maybe around her waist she has some bags or things like that just to keep things in. I'm still not really sure how I want her armor to connect. Now I'm just trying out some different things. It's really easy to try out different things when you're working digitally because you can undo and redo and put things on different layers. It really allows you to be more flexible and try things you normally wouldn't try. Right now I'm just blocking in her hair, trying to make it flow a little bit better. Thinking maybe she has this huge cloak that kind of wraps around and crops off at the bottom. One of the things I've been working on a lot lately with some of my other paintings is having a lot more loaded edges, and by loaded edges I mean having things crop off the sides or off the top and bottom. Just gives it a more dynamic and interesting feel. Not necessarily for this piece, but for my other paintings I've been doing that a lot. And just blocking in her hair. Right now I'm also trying to think of good shadow patterns and light patterns on her body. This tool right here I use a lot for background and texture. I like to work all over the canvas just so I can get a better idea of how things are going. Even if I'm not really sure what I want to paint, I still kind of scribble in some things here and there. That way it'll give me some kind of an idea of where I want to go. Plus sometimes I find things in the chaos of the scribbles that I normally wouldn't have thought of. Right now I'm just pushing some of the lights in her face and her body. Now I'm getting rid of that other arm since I didn't like it. Thinking maybe if it's lower, like holding her cloak, but that doesn't really work. So I'm thinking maybe she can hold some kind of weapon, like a spear. That way I can kind of fill up the negative space on the right side of the canvas. Plus I can show how I paint hands. Again, I'm not too worried about details. I'm just trying to get things down on the canvas so I can have a general idea of where I want to go. I didn't really like her top, so I'm just gonna open it up and make it skin instead. Still not really sure about the design, so I'm just kind of playing around. Maybe I'll fill in this entire area. You'll notice that I flip the canvas a lot, and I just have that bound to a key. So you can just go up here and go to Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts, and you go down to Image, and scroll down to Rotate Canvas, and you go to Flip Horizontally, and I just have it set to Command F. So you can just type that in there, click Accept, and OK. I guess since now that we're on the subject of shortcuts, I'll explain some of the other shortcuts I use a lot. I set Command Shift F to flip just the selection horizontally instead of the whole canvas. I also use Command T to transform objects, Command Shift W to warp a selection, and Command Shift D to distort a selection. And for increasing and decreasing brush size, I just have that set to my tablet buttons, but if you use the keyboard, you can use the bracket keys. And also to move the canvas around, I have that set to a tablet key, but you can also use the space bar. At the beginning of the tutorial, you'll notice that I maximized the image window to fill the entire screen, and to do that you just hit F. If you hit that twice, it'll maximize it, and if you hit Tab, you can actually close the menu bars. If you don't want to hit F, you can go to View and Screen Mode and select it through there. Or you can just select it through the toolbar on the left-hand side of the screen. It's at the very bottom. The mode I'm working in right now is called Full Screen Mode with Menu Bar. I'm just trying to lock down the value range, trying to get a good balance between the lightness of her skin and the darkness of her armor. And I'm flipping the canvas a lot too, so they can see my errors more easily. Now I'm just going back in and trying to pick out some little details in the armor. Add some negative spaces on the arms. Make these some leather straps. It's always a good idea to add some visual interest between different parts. You don't even have to fully detail something out, just as long as there's some hint of visual interest. And just to get your eye moving across the canvas. I'm just adding some random squiggles in her chest armor so that I can break up the space a little bit, even though I'm not really sure what I want it to look like yet. I'm switching to that rectangular chalk brush I was talking about earlier so I can paint the different planes in the face. I usually start out with this brush for the face, and then once I start refining details, I'll switch back to the round brush. I also have another rectangular brush with more texture that I like to use for the skin. I'm thinking maybe the shadows in her hair are too dark since she's light-haired, so I'm just making that a little bit lighter. You'll notice that if I don't get the stroke right the first time, I'll just delete it and try again. Now I'm just adding in a fill light on her back so I can separate out her back from her cloak. I'm trying to keep her armor pretty light, so I'm just keeping her torso fairly free from armor. But I have these tassets down here, so I'm going to add some straps to kind of show how they connect. It doesn't have to completely make sense, just as long as it looks believable or cool. So this is a pretty good spot to start adding some color. I don't want to wait too long to add color because if I refine my black and white drawing for too long, I tend to have a harder time adding color to it. I try and leave it a little bit loose so I can add a base color and then start painting opaquely on top of that. So now I'm going to add a new layer and set that layer to overlay. And select this texture brush I was using in the beginning. I'm just going to lay in a base color for the skin as well as adding some color to the armor. I'm also not really sure what kind of color scheme I want to do, so I'm just laying in a brown color. I'm thinking maybe for the background I'll add in some greens and some blues, maybe some oranges. That way I just have some contrast between the background and the figure. Usually for adding color I'll use an overlay layer, or sometimes I'll use a hard light or multiply. Typically I use a combination of all three in order to add color. Adding color for me is a long process that utilizes different color modes, different layers, as well as painting opaquely. I've said this before, but there's no magical filter to add color. It's a process. But at the same time, I don't want to go too cliche or too hokey with the layer effects, so I just try to keep it natural. I don't want to make it shout that this is a digital painting. So for that reason, I try to use as many texture brushes as possible. And I usually use a texture overlay as well. I don't know if you noticed, but I switched to the airbrush tool. I use that a lot when I'm painting glow effects on the hair or something, or the light parts of the face. Now I'm going in and adding some darker parts to the skin. And I'm saturating some areas that meet the shadow. A lot of times you'll have more saturated colors when the lights meet the darks. I'm just going in and adding some blue color. It'll be a good complement for the orange. I'm thinking maybe the fill light behind her will be a bluish color too. But I'm not really sure yet. Usually when I'm concepting out a female warrior, I try not to go the cliche route of putting her in a bikini armor just because, they wouldn't have really worn that kind of thing. But I realized in this demo I wanted to focus on painting the form, and I was kind of getting away from that by covering her up, so I just decided to go back and put her in the bikini armor. Making a sudden drastic change like this in a painting is always a little tough for me, just because it goes through this weird, ugly phase where nothing looks right, and it just takes a little while for me to push things around until they look okay. I've actually switched back to my default round brush that has a hardness of 100%. I'm not using any reference for this. I'm pretty much just relying on what I remembered from figure drawing classes in school and whatnot. If at all possible, it's good to get some kind of reference. Having a little bit of reference next to you can make a big difference in your painting. I think once you paint something enough times, you tend to remember how to paint it, so you don't really need reference later on. You just need to build up that visual library. It's one of the great things about the Academy. They offered so many different figure drawing workshops. You should take advantage of those if you can. I've noticed in a lot of people's paintings, as well as my own paintings, that people can paint very well from life, but when they try to paint from their imagination, there's a little bit of a gap there. And I think it's just because people haven't built up that visual library yet. They still need to rely on looking at something instead of creating it from their imagination. It's just one of those things that takes time and practice. I mean, pretty soon you'll make it to the point where you don't have to look at anything. You can just paint from your head. As I'm painting this, I'm still trying to figure out the armor design, so I'll probably end up going through a few different iterations. Right now I'm just going back in and adding some pools of light and pools of dark just so I can get some kind of an interesting lighting scheme. I have my main light source coming from the upper left hand side of the screen, so I'm just going to try and have my lights just flow down from that area. Just trying to find some interesting shadow shapes. Sometimes I'll fudge the light source just a little bit so I can get something interesting in there even though it's not technically correct. It's one of the good things about having artistic license. You can kind of mess things around just as long as they look cool. Right now I'm selecting a round brush that has a little bit of a soft edge just so I can get some softer edges over here. This is one of the areas that you don't want to have too many hard edges. I believe this brush has a hardness of 53%. I'm going in now and trying to add a little more saturated colors because my colors were getting a little muddy and grayed out. You'll notice that I go over areas a lot. It's because I have a really light touch when I'm painting. I just try to build up areas very subtly. I'm switching back to the 100% hardness brush, the round brush. I've been working zoomed out the entire time just so that I don't get bogged down in the little details, just so I can get things placed correctly. I try and stay zoomed out for as long as possible. It also saves a lot of time too. And this is actually the first time that I've zoomed in. I'm just trying to get these shapes correct, a little more precise. If you work zoomed in all the time, a lot of times when you zoom out, things will look a little weird or a little off. And that's just because it's hard to relate things to each other when you're zoomed in so close. So a lot of times when you zoom out, it'll help. One thing you want to keep in mind when you're painting the breast is to watch your edge control. You want to have both soft and hard edges. If you go all hard edges, then it's going to look weird, and vice versa if you have all soft edges. One of the great places is right under the breast, where you can actually get hard edges, cast shadows, and reflected light from her body. Now, between the reflected light and the light side, you're going to have the core shadow, or the Terminator shadow. And that's actually going to help you create form and make things turn in space. Now I'm just flipping the image and working on the other side. And I'm going back to the airbrush tool. I just want a really smooth transition on her chest right here. If you notice at the top, I have my opacity set to 100% and the flow set to 100%, but under the brush controls I have the opacity set to pen pressure. I just realized that her right breast is a lot bigger than her left breast, and if you zoom out you can really see the difference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select her torso and do a copy merged. And what copy merge does is it will copy all the layers so you don't have to flatten your image or anything. And the shortcut for copy merge on a Mac is Command Shift C, or if you're on a PC it's Control Shift C. And once you copy that and hit paste, it'll paste the merge selection onto a new layer. On the new layer we just made, I'm gonna go to filter and liquify. And this is how I'm gonna change her body without having to repaint anything. So as you can see, I'm just kind of moving things around, changing the size of her breast and changing the center line of her body because they were pushed over a little too far. I have the first tool on the upper left selected to do this. The one below that just erases things and reconstructs things back to its original position. Below that is twirl, and below that one makes things smaller, and the one below that makes it larger. So you can see it looks a little bit better now. Now I'm going back and thinking about how her pauldrons actually attach to her body. So I'm thinking maybe they attach to her neck armor with some kind of a strap or something. And I'm also going in and adding straps around her waist. They go down and they attach to her tassets. I made these straps going to the opposite direction of the straps just below those, just so that there's more movement and so that it carries your eye to the bottom of the canvas. Having opposing diagonals really helps your composition a lot of times. And I'm just going in, trying to smooth out some of the parts of her body. I'm still not really sure how the bottom of her armor is, so I'm just kind of searching around, trying to pull out little plates of armor. Maybe she has some kind of a metal codpiece. I'm going in with a lighter color and adding in some highlights here and there and some sharp edges. This way I can have different materials in her costume. The bright highlights to indicate metal, and it's just a good juxtaposition with the leather and the cloth. One of the ways to inject a little bit of realism into your fantasy armor is to just research how real armor works. Just think about the little details that will help sell it, like the little straps, Think about how the armor actually attaches to different pieces of armor, or how the armor sits on the body. Things like that will help it look more believable. Right here I'm adding in the shadows under her rib cage since her chest is thrust out, so it'll fall into shadow under here. Plus it'll create some good shapes. It doesn't look right. I think her center line is still off a little bit. Yeah, I need to fix that. So I'm gonna select her torso again and hit copy merge and then do filter liquify. You can change the brush size over here on the right. I'm actually gonna move everything over to the right a little bit. Using the liquify tool, you have to be pretty subtle and very careful with how much you move things around because it can become pretty distorted fairly easily. Just why I'm moving everything in very tiny amounts. Let's see how that looks. That looks a little better. I think I need to fix the ellipse on her top over here, just so that it wraps around a little bit more. Now I'm going back in and finding her center line and adding those shadows. I'm also adding some hints of her serratus interior muscles. Just trying to find the placement of her belly button. Now I'm just reinforcing the cast shadow. Cast shadows can also have different edges. You can have hard edges and soft edges. Usually the area where the shadow originates from has a harder edge, and as it goes out from that area, the shadow becomes softer and softer. It becomes more diffused. I need to figure out how her top actually wraps around and attaches to her back. So I'm just gonna erase out that part. Worry about it later. I'm also going in and adding her clavicles. When you're painting the female body, usually it's a pretty good idea to be pretty subtle with the transitions. You want to have a soft feel to it, which can actually be harder to paint females because, you have to make them look softer and more delicate most of the time. With males, you can just kind of throw strokes around, and if it's rugged and jagged, it actually adds to the male character. Her head looks a little too small, so I'm just gonna select it with the marquee tool and do a copy merged and paste. And I'm just gonna do a Command T or Control T to free transform it, just to make it a little bit bigger. I need to find a way for her top to connect, so I'm just gonna add a strap going straight across. This way I can add a cool little shadow below it. When you have cast shadows, it's always a good idea to try and think of what the form is doing that the shadow falls upon. That way you can actually use the cast shadow as sort of an element that describes what the form looks like without having to completely render out that form. I'm pretty much just refining shapes and noodling things a little too much, going in and cutting shapes out. I kind of hit spots all over the canvas. I'll find something I want to go fix, and then I'll realize there's something else I want to go fix, and I'll jump over to that. I made her hips a little too small, so I'm just going in and making them a little bit wider. Now I'm just cleaning up the edges around the straps. Well, that's the end of part 1. I'll see you in part 2.